right, so today I'm going to be going through this carburetor and talking about some of the basic functions of an Autolite 2100 or 4100 carburetor, because the 4100 is just a couple of extra bowls on the back, so it's not that much different than what you're dealing with right here on this one. And the basic first thing you want to do when you're working on one of these carburetors is check fuel pressure. If it is running, make sure that you're getting 6-ish PSI at the entrance to the carburetor right here. Because if you're getting over that, these carburetors are really bad about allowing push through the needle and seat, and it'll flood over the carburetor and it'll run like crap. Or if you're not getting enough fuel in here, you'll get fuel starvation at the top end of what you're doing. So always go in, grab yourself a fuel pressure gauge from Summit, Speedway Motors. A lot of these different places carry those things. Pop that thing in line right before it goes into the carburetor itself, and then you'll know what your fuel pressure is into the carburetor. Very important that that keeps at a maximum of 7 PSI. You go over that, you're going to start having problems with it wanting to overdrive the carburetor. All right, now I'm going to pull this off because I don't want it slinging around everywhere. We're going to talk about the idle circuit on these carburetors. All right, so you've established that you got fuel pressure on the car. One thing a lot of guys don't realize is these Autolite carburetors, and the Motorcrafts too sometimes, will have a screen beyond this nut right here. There's actually a wire screen inside this portion of the carburetor. So you want to make sure that that wire screen is not plugged. So you want to pull this off, check that screen in there, and if the screen is plugged, then you're going to need to either replace the screen or clean it out. One of the methods that you can use to clean them out is you can actually light them on fire. Works. And then you go in, you can also scrub brush clean them and things like that to get all the rest of the particulate off of it. Hopefully you have a fuel filter somewhere out here beyond this carburetor to keep that from being an issue. I really like using the Ford style pumps that have the canister on them with the actual filter inside the canister. They tend to clean things up a little bit better than you might get otherwise. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the idle circuit. Now these two ports right here are where everything comes into your fuel system on these Autolite 2100s for idle. I can't see where my screwdriver is going, but these two holes right here are where your fuel comes in. Everything feeds in through there. Most of the small block Autolite 2100s use a 47 jet in that location. The big block cars typically went to a 52. But everything runs through there. Anything you do with your idle circuit goes through that point. I'm going to pull these annular discharge boosters out of the way for a second. I'm going to flip this thing over. This is where Ford went in and actually opened up the ports for the air mixture into the fuel system. The ones below it, that's where your jets go in. Now, when you're doing your jets typically in a starting point on either an Autolite or even a Holley is 1.5 turns out. You honestly will do better adjusting this with a vacuum gauge and also using eye and ear. If the engine is shaking around a lot, you'll probably be able to pull some of that out with the idle adjustment screws. Usually if it's got a bad shake to it and you get a lot of smell in the air from the gasoline, you're probably pushed out too much. The jets or the mixture screws are too open and you'll want to go back in. You will need to let the screws sit for just a second before they actually go in and finalize. So in other words, they'll need a second to settle in. You'll screw it in and you'll wait 1, 2, 3, and then kind of look around and see what the engine's doing. Check your vacuum gauge to see if your vacuum has stabilized. So that goes in through there. I'm going to flip it on its back. Typically on these type of carburetors, on the Autolite carburetors, you do not want to open the throttle blades up when you're at idle. If you do, you could start inducing it into the main boosters at idle, and you're going to get a very rich idle setting on it. These should be almost completely shut. You may need to do a hair's breadth adjustment on it, but that is going to be where they need to sit. It'll have almost a moan to it whenever it is at idle. All right, now you'll see with this that we have, these are the holes and ports for your fuel delivery. The larger ports down here toward the bottom, that's where the fuel is going to come in. And then these holes here, you'll see two here with the blades completely shut. Those are air bleed holes. Now if you open it up a little more, you'll see another set of holes exposed. And you open it up more, that's another set of holes exposed. Typically, if the car is completely stock, you're not going to have an issue with needing to open these throttle blades up in order to get a good idle out of it. If you have good vacuum signal in the car and the carburetor is completely tight with no vacuum leaks, you should be able to stay somewhere either near shut or completely shut. Because even with a near shut on these, you still get some air leak around the ports here on the bottom of the carburetor. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this thing over, and I'm going to talk about the rest of the idle circuit on this. Your idle circuit on here is here and here on either side of the carburetor, and that runs up into the booster assembly here. This is your port for fuel and also air. Will be pulled in through here as well. It's got 2 ports here and the 2 ports on the inside. This is where your full pickup for your fuel for idle is. It also has air bleeds in it as well, and those are pretty much here in the dead center. You got air bleeds in the dead center. You have a high-speed idle bleeds on the back. Now, one thing I want to show you is exactly what we talk about with cleanliness on these carburetors that is really important. You'll notice that this air bleed on this side that I got to it, and it is cleaned out, but this one has still got dirt in it, so it's not going to perform the way it's supposed to, and that's going to go in and also change the way the carburetor is seeing fuel on this side, which would be the passenger side of the car. So that bank over there may have a transfer problem from idle to your main booster assembly. All right, I'm going to flip the carburetor over on its back and around this way. And basically what I'm going to talk about now is the accelerator pump system. You have a fuel port that comes in through here. All of your accelerator pump operation is done off of this arm right here on the carburetor. And you have different settings. Typically on a Ford, you're going to be running in the 2nd position. I've never really seen them where they're running in the 1st, 3rd, or 4th position because what you're doing is the higher up you go, the richer the mixture is going in, and Ford seems to like that 2nd spot. They give you all these places to play, but you probably aren't going to need them. Also, you can check the service manuals. The service manuals will show you where the arm needs to be for what particular carburetor, whether you're at high altitude or whatever. It'll show you what position that this arm needs to be set in. I don't have the arm in here right now. It typically runs across here to an arm here and actuates the pump in here. And that all goes into this central point right here on this carburetor. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my air up here and I'm going to run air into that if I can get it down in here enough, because you can just feel it. And that's coming right out through that. Andrew's going to hate that. So I'll do it again. It comes out through the central point, and that is your actual point of pickup for your accelerator pump itself, which comes up through here, and there's a screw that goes right in the middle here. You'll note that there are 2 nozzles on either side here. That's your shootout point for the accelerator pump. Inside of here, there is the shaft that I showed you last week and the little ball. The ball is actually the check ball. That's what controls everything, but the shaft is nothing but a weight to keep that ball in position so that it doesn't just start burbling fuel into the discharge boosters and over-signaling gas into the system. And that's really all that's for. So that would set down in there like that. Your discharge boosters shoot onto the side of the 2 Venturis here, and you're good to go. Now that's going to all happen when the throttle plates are open to accelerate the car. You're going to see a squirt of fuel on there. Anytime you're running and possibly have a system where you're not sure you're getting gas, what you can do is just kind of crack those throttle plates open, and the fuel nozzles are going to squirt fuel down onto the Venturis, and you'll know you have gas in the float bowl, so you know you can actually possibly run the car because you do have gas in it. At that point, you probably have a different problem in the car. And that's really basically it. That's your accelerator pump system. All right, now what I'm going to talk about is the main jet circuit. Now, like I said, you need to make sure you know what your main jets are. When I say typically, please consult your service manual for what jets go in here. What I said with the 47Fs, okay, that's probably true, but there are some differences in there with different year models. The Cleveland may have different jets on there. So your main jets are basically what control the average run and metering of the car while it's going down the road. So these 2 jets control each venturi on the carburetor back here. I'm going to pull the booster assembly out. I'm going to talk a little bit about the emulsion tubes and this kind of a booster package. The cool thing about these is Ford went to a lot of trouble to set these up to work with this particular type of carburetor and this particular type of vehicle. I think a lot of what goes on with Autolite carburetors could be a problem with the annular discharge boosters being pulled out of something else and thrown into a car that they're not supposed to be in, because I have seen different amounts of side holes on these emulsion tubes here, and it's not always the same. They're not always the same inside. The pickup tubes are sometimes a little bit different, and that's depending on what is written right here, like I said last week, on the actual booster itself. So all of your main run setup runs right through here. Now, someone said last week that the boosters are listed in the shop manuals. I did not see that. I do know that they are listed in the Ford parts manuals, but I don't think they really list where they go. They just want you to be able to pick them up and look and go, okay, that's a BW9. So you order a BW9 from Ford and you're good to go. I would love to know somehow, if someone's got this information, I'd love to see it, what those letters correspond to in the Ford parts catalogs, if there is a way to know what the BW9 or the BW goes to on a car. I'm feeling pretty confident that these are the original boosters on this car that we're doing this off of, which is a 63 Galaxy. All right, now what you've got down in here is people may wonder what these two ports are. These are a set of ports that are for helping to control the vacuum signal within the car, because if I take and flip the carburetor over, you'll notice that there's two corresponding ports here that correlate to two vacuum slots on the bottom side of the carburetor, and there's also one that goes from the power valve setup here into this cavity on the bottom, and then there's another port that's way up in the top of this that goes into the very top of the assembly here, which goes, I believe, to that port right there. So that's all vacuum related, so that you got a good solid line on it. I think what they do with that is they tend to put those in there to help control any flutter in the flow past the boosters here. I will come back to these real quickly before I seal this section off and say the reason I like these types so much is because they don't just squirt fuel onto the inside of the Venturi from that port. There are actually little holes all the way around the inside of this booster assembly that give the fuel a much more atomizing effect when it comes out. Really like the way Ford did that, and nobody else really picked it up. That makes this almost, as one of my friends used to tell me, John Einert, it makes it almost like fuel injection. So I really do like that on them. All right, I'm going to flip this thing over and talk about the power valve circuit a little bit. All right, so your power valve screws in right here. One of the things I will say is on these Autolites, sometimes there is an issue with the actual power valve not interfacing well with the backing plate. I have had a couple of these where the power valve, the aftermarket ones, won't allow the actual cover to seat. So you'll want to make sure you check that when you go in. Sometimes I've also heard from other viewers that let me know that the power valve will not seat to the seal that goes in the center here. You're just going to have to make sure you check all that when you put everything together. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and probably put the power valve that we got from National Parts Depot in here in just a second, just to show you what I'm talking about and make sure everything here fits and runs the way it's supposed to. Power valve, basically all that really is it's a good shot of fuel. Once your vacuum drops below whatever the preset for that is, on most of these Autolite carburetors and the Motorcraft carburetors, you're running an 8.5 power valve on your small block cars all the way up through probably the Cleveland, and that power valve dropping to 8. And what that means is that from idle, let's say you're at 16 inches of vacuum at idle, when you drop down below 8.5 inches of vacuum, then the power valve will come into play. Under hard acceleration, the power valve is going to pop open because you're going to drop all your vacuum, and then it'll give you a good shot of fuel in there to pop with all that air that's supposedly coming in. Although if you're running a closed element air cleaner, you're probably not going to get a lot of air. Not going to be a lot, it's going to be some air. So some better air, maybe. All right, grab my carburetor kit. I have my cover, my gasket, and my 8.5 power valve from National Parts Depot. I'm going to put this in first. All right, so I'm going to spin this in, and you'll notice that the gasket is spinning with the power valve. That tells me that we are getting a good seal between the power valve and the body of the carburetor. We're getting a good seal between the power valve and the carburetor body. I'm just going to put a little bit of a spin on it. I'm not going to do too much because you don't want to gorilla up on that, because you've got the aluminum threads going into an aluminum body, and you can actually strip the threads out of it. I'm going to set it back down, put my gasket down, and I'm going to just set this on there and see if I've got good seating all the way around on the gasket, because I was a little concerned about this last week, not wanting to seal. What will happen a lot of times is people will gorilla up on this cover on the power valve and actually bend the corners down a little bit. I want to see this a little more flat, so I will probably, before I go back and do the full assembly next week, actually take these corners and just tweak them back a little bit. And I'll show you that next week when we go in and actually do the full build on this, and we'll be done with this thing, thankfully, at that point. But that's not going to work because you'll have an air leak around there. It's going to cause you some problems. I'm not going to really go into the choke system completely on this. There is some stuff that you need to be aware of from a vacuum leak perspective, and that is if there is not a gasket on this port right here, you could possibly see a vacuum leak around this. So there's a small figure 8 gasket in your Walker kit that you get from NPD that can fix that issue right there so that this does not create a vacuum leak, because it will create a vacuum leak, and they are very hard to find because it's in behind the choke assembly right here, and a little hard to get anything in there to spray on that. You can spray around, hit this, and think you're actually picking up a vacuum signal leak on the bottom edge of the carburetor right there. And that's the other thing on these carburetors, because of the amount of ports and stuff that they put on them for vacuum on this, vacuum signal on an Autolite 4100 or 2100 is a big deal. You want to make sure that your base plate on your carburetor is nice and flat. You want to go in with a nice straight edge that you know is a known good straight edge. View the base plate on here and make sure everything's sitting well. They do a good job with fairly thick gaskets on these usually for the 2100s, so you don't have as big an issue with that. But if somebody's gone in and really crunked down on these 4 points on the carburetor, you can end up having the ears pulled in some, and then you'll need to go in and do a sanding on some, like a really nice piece of flat granite with a large sheet of 600 paper to flatten this thing back out again, so you've got a good seal on here so you don't have any vacuum leaks. Cool little tips on these carburetors, kind of a fun thing. You can actually take this carburetor, have the lid on it like this, pull out the center port, take out the screws, and screw around with your adjustments on this carburetor for float and all, and it will run without the top on it. It's not clean, it's not pretty, but it can be done. Realistically, that's pretty much everything I can think of on these things at this point. I can go through and do a little bit more, but that gives you a basic idea of where you're at on what each one of these little sections on the carburetor does. There are a ton of other little idiosyncratic things on these that could be gone into, but when you start doing that, you're basically a guy who's probably going to be rebuilding a ton of these, and I'm not going to go that deep because most of the guys who are doing this are not going to be that deep as well. One thing, like I said, for final, ports. Make sure all of them are clean. If they're not, you're going to have signal issues, and the carburetor's not going to run like it's supposed to. All right, so that's it on the carburetor. Next, we're going to go in and finish the build-up on this thing. This week, I was injured, and I could not actually stand around and do the work that needed to be done. Nothing big, but it's just very painful to stand, so I'm sitting here doing this week to kind of put a little break in between, because I got a couple more things I want to do to this to finish it up. We're actually going to send this off with Cam. He's going to throw it in an ultrasound so we can see how that turns it around and makes it look a little bit better. Speaking of looking a little bit better, why don't you go out and check out our Patreon account at the $10 monthly level. You get monthly meetings with me, and if we have ever done anything to help you out, it's a good way to say thank you for that on a monthly basis. Anything from like $1 all the way up to $1 million, we'll take that money, believe me. I'll probably stop doing this, hand it off to Cam, and I'll retire to the Catskills or somewhere. Probably not Catskills, it's too cold in the winter up there. But that money doesn't go to me. That money actually goes to help the guys in here. It pays Andrew's salary, and I'm trying to teach Andrew that you don't make more money unless you make more money. This is not a government institution. This is AutoRestomod. Also, subscribe to the channel. We're at 97,000. We are danger close to our 100,000 mark. Peter McKinnon, I don't know, Cletus McFarland, Roadkill. At this point, I'll take viewers from Chakuhaka Laki Maki's little channel that's in India somewhere. Fire them off to us. We'll take them so we can get to our 100,000 mark and I can just shut up about this. It is becoming annoying to me as well. So that's where we're going. But that's not all, folks, because you know where I'm headed. We're going for the super thanks. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. The worst named thing that the guys at YouTube have ever come up with, and yet we are trying to use it as a way to make money, to help out the kids. Mostly it's to help me buy dinner, because I got 5 of them boys, and I'm telling you right now, those suckers can eat like a side of beef a day, probably. I don't know for real, but that's kind of where I envision it being. So do me a favor, folks. Be kind to each other, love each other, treat each other nice. You guys have a great week, and we'll see you next time on AutoRestomod. Cam is here today. He is just lying on the floor, giving me help. Like when I'm doing this, he's answering questions for me and doing stuff like that. So he's just laying over there on the floor. Don't know why, but he is on the floor.